Hi everybody, welcome to Talking Automotive. My name's Johnston Clare and my co-host Mark Pallavestra.
Hi John, today we've got Mat Prestney. Mat Prestney is the director of Plumfleet, and Matt's covering a very important topic which is very much front of mind right now with COVID taking over our workplace situations and most people working from home, and that is the subject of grey fleet. So grey fleet's where employees use their own vehicle. Matt covers off some amazing information and highlights the risks and also the strategies and processes to put in place to minimise those risks. There's some significant financial implication for employers and the safety of the employees.
Yeah, Mark, what was really scary to me is the liability and what you can be held liable for. Even if you have director's insurance, there's a whole range of criminal charges that can be brought against you. There are very large fines that can be brought against you. So it's an important topic to really understand. It's something that doesn't look that serious because you let your employee drive on your behalf to do some sort of work activity, and how that fits in the legislation in terms of work and safety and what is your liability in that respect. So very good topic, worth listening to. We look forward to bringing you the show.
Let's get into it. Today's guest speaker is Mat Prestney. Mat Prestney is a director at Plumfleet. Matt has an extensive background in the automotive industry, coming from a family Ford franchise in rural Victoria. But also Matt has extensive experience with lease plan, both here in Australia and over in the UK, and time at General Motors Holden, before moving to Custom Fleet in a senior role. Welcome, Mat Prestney.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Matt, from our side, it's really great to have you on the show. It's a real privilege to be able to chat someone of your experience and your background in that. So we really appreciate you making time to speak to us.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Maybe to start off, just a very basic question, just to get us on the go. Can you explain to us what is a traditional fleet?
A traditional fleet. It's a good question. Look, I guess at the end of the day, fleet is about mobility. It's about ensuring that an organisation, whether they're publicly owned or privately owned, is able to take its goods and services to market and deliver them to the end user. And the vehicles played a significant role in that process all along, whether it's taking goods or whether it's taking an individual out to sell or to service somebody or to look after people in an aged care scenario, whatever it might be. The vehicle has been a great enabler in that side of things for basically since vehicles began. A traditional fleet historically was a fleet that was owned and operated by the employer. They would have a car park of vehicles that would typically be distributed to their employees on the basis of either requirement or entitlement, and they would be funded by the employer. And then we saw in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s and into the 80s, the rise of the leasing companies that would come in and take over the funding of those vehicles. But the baseline remained the same. The employer had the responsibility for the car. The employee was responsible for driving the vehicle and maintaining it in a suitable manner. But the bulk of the risk on ownership and maintenance of the vehicle came back to the employer. And you would see large car parks of cars, all typically from the same manufacturer, and the employer would have that relationship directly with a dealer group or the manufacturer or both in buying those vehicles. And hence why you would see and still do see to some degree very strong fleet dealers in the marketplace who had that relationship with the companies that were buying or leasing the vehicles.
So that would it be fair to say that there's a handful of brands traditionally would have played in that fleet space? It wouldn't have been the 60 brands that we see.
No, not at all. And, Holden and Ford originally were very, very strong, and then over the years, due to the breadth of product and quality of product, the Toyota brand became incredibly strong in this space. And then you saw Hyundai mirror that quite successfully over the last 15 years. So you did have these traditional fleet brands that were in the marketplace. But over time, Mark, you're right, as we've seen the proliferation of brands in the Australian marketplace, it's changed the way that fleet is seen and operates from an OEM point of view and a dealer point of view. But yeah, you have those traditional brands, absolutely.
Because the fleet market is, if you count the demo side of it as well, so the private market's 50% of the Australian market. So fleet really is the other 50% in some shape or form.
Yeah. And historically for manufacturers and dealers, it was bread and butter because these vehicles were replaced regularly. These vehicles were serviced regularly. They were always presenting to the dealership, and a smart dealer would look after that side of the business really, really well because they knew they could count on that as a revenue stream ongoing. Retail might oscillate depending on the economic circumstances, but if you looked after your fleet customers, you could rest assured they'd come back and buy from you as a dealer or an OEM. And certainly, for a number of reasons, they would bring their vehicles back into the shop to be serviced and repaired. So it was a really important 50% of that market. It still is, albeit it's changed significantly.
So it's good for revenue for after sales for a dealer.
Yep.
It's good for the sale, albeit the margin's probably a little bit skinnier than a retail, but there's some questions over sometimes the profitability of a retail sale. So you sell the car, you get regular service because it's controlled by the leasing company or by the owner of the vehicle that it gets serviced appropriately and on time. And then it's also a good used car opportunity because these cars get turned over in less than 5 years or 8 years.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say?
Absolutely. And, if they're well maintained and typically the fleet vehicles are, certainly vehicles that were part of a larger fleet, they would be good news on a used car lot because the service history is there, it's strong. And certain brands or certain organisations, fleet vehicles, would build a reputation for being excellent used car vehicles, and dealers would compete to have them on their yards. They'd buy them at auction houses and put them on the used car lot because they sold well.
Now, Matt, what would be the average term of a traditional fleet car? How long would they be retained by those customers or those leasing companies?
Well, there's a bit of a divide there. Your standard tool of trade salesperson vehicle or a service delivery vehicle, would be between that 36 to 48 months. And then if you move to your light commercial vehicle side, the proper tool of trade vehicles that are kitted out, the average life cycle, I'd say, will be closer to 60 months.
So 5 years.
Yeah.
That's interesting because we've interviewed Ben Sullivan from Potentiate a couple of weeks ago, and the new car buyer survey showed that private buyers actually keep their cars for 8 years, or just under 8 years. And that was news that sort of surprised us. We have all been labouring under the impression that you turn your car over at least by 5 years, but it's the fleet cars actually get turned over faster than the private customers.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a number of reasons for that. The incentives that the OEMs put in place don't hurt either based on the volume rebates that would apply to turn those vehicles because they want new metal on the road. They want the new brand or the new mark on the road with the organisation's name on it, or historically that's how it rolled. But certainly, and I know we'll move on to talk about grey fleets, but when you look at the profile of a grey fleet, which is privately owned vehicles used for work, they are typically a lot older than your average organisational fleet car park. And there's some risks associated with that.
So that then introduces an interesting question about this whole grey fleet idea. Now, with COVID, the new normal, and we're hearing from all the demographers that we're all going to change. We're going to do more of this Zoom stuff, more working from home, less office use. Therefore, your home environment becomes the office and your car becomes the office, and more of us are going to be doing that.
Yeah.
So this is the question, I suppose, from our perspective is, can you explain what is that grey fleet bit there?
Yeah, look, so take a step right back. The term grey fleet causes some confusion in the marketplace. The baseline for what grey fleet is all about comes down to the treatment of any vehicle under the Workplace Health and Safety Act or the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Victoria. Any vehicle that's used for work purposes is treated as a place of work, irrespective of who owns that car. So that's the baseline. So whether it's a vehicle owned wholly and solely by the organisation and provided to Mark as a salesperson to drive around, through to a novated lease provided by a salary packaging company, all the way through to a fully privately owned vehicle that John might jump in, for example, to go and see a client. When that vehicle is being used for work purposes, it is treated as a place of work. With that as the baseline, under the Acts, there are certain duties that an employer and an employee have as it relates to a place of work. The duty of care and the chain of responsibility kicks in as well. So it's incumbent initially on the employer to ensure, as far as is reasonably practicable, that the place of work is safe, and free from risk. So if you think about it from the point of view of an office floor, a lot of energy and effort goes into that on the part of the employer to make sure that the workplace is safe. There are systems and processes put in place that outline the employer and the employee's duty and obligations to be safe whilst at work. Desks, desk heights, chairs, cable, all of those things. The same applies to a motor vehicle. When a fleet vehicle is owned or operated through a leasing company or by the employer, the systems and processes are in place there in the traditional fleet method. It's relatively easy for an employer, if they're ever asked, to prove out, yes, my fleet vehicles are insured and they're insured appropriately. Yes, they're well maintained and here are the records. Yes, the tyres are checked and here are the records and here's our policy around replacement and here is our procurement and disposal methodology. So when they reach a certain age or case, this is what we do with them. And there's financial reasons for doing that, but of course there are safety reasons for doing it as well. The issue for the grey fleet is that if, as and when an employer allows an employee to start to use their own privately owned vehicle to conduct work, how does the employer ensure those same protocols are in place and enforced and provable? What reasonably practicable steps can that employer take and ask their employee to undertake in the context of that privately owned vehicle being used for work? Now, it's interesting. A lot of the time when you have this conversation initially with employers, they may sit back and they go, well, it's not that much of a problem. But if you look at the statistics, and I often ask employers, what do you think the single most dangerous thing an employee does on your behalf is? And more often than not, it's actually just getting in a vehicle and driving on their behalf. Certainly if they run a mining business or a construction site or certain processing plants, there are more dangerous things that staff do, but there are really heavy protocols around that activity. For most organisations, the single most dangerous thing that their staff will do on behalf of the employer is get in a car and drive. And then when you look at the statistics of workplace health and safety stats around fatalities in the workplace, close to 50% of workplace fatalities involve a vehicle of some sort. So it's really worthwhile asking the question as an employer, am I taking all reasonable steps to ensure I minimise risk when people drive on my behalf? And not just risks to the employees, but risks to others, because the Acts define that as well, the general public.
Matt, carrying on from there, what are the legal perspectives of that? Are there any penalties that can be held accountable? Is there anything that employers need to be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. A breach of the Act is a criminal offence. So some organisations think they can take out directors' insurance and get around this. Quite simply, you cannot insure against a criminal charge. I'm sure some people would like to be able to think they can do that, but directors' insurance will not protect you against a criminal charge. So the consequences for a breach can be significant. We're talking millions of dollars in fines for an organisation, or the potential for jail time for company officers who are found to have breached the Act. And alas, I don't like bringing this up, but we may see this actually enacted in Victoria in due course with what happened in that horrible incident on the Eastern Freeway with the police officers and that truck driver. Because certain states, and Victoria and Queensland have led the way, have actually given the Occupational Health and Safety Act, as in Victoria, or the Queensland version of the Workplace Health and Safety Act, they've given it teeth in the form of corporate manslaughter provisions. The Acts haven't changed, but the penalties have, and they are significantly increased penalties for employers who are found to have breached the provisions of the Act. I think it's significant time in jail and significant monetary penalties. So beyond the moral requirement that you should take responsibility for your staff and their safety whilst at work, the implications of a breach are now significant.
And Matt, is it more than just a vehicle issue? Because when you look at grey fleet, you mentioned before about the cars they're retained for, more or longer than the traditional fleet model. So people are driving cars that are 8, 10 years, maybe 15 years old. So they don't have the latest safety equipment versus the traditional fleet. They're not maintained necessarily as well as the traditional fleet. And is there any other issues around grey fleet, around drivers' ability to drive, driving records and all these bits and pieces? So is it broader than just the automotive vehicle? Is there more to grey fleet than just the car?
There is. It's about how staff get around. I guess the vehicle is still the primary means through which a person will conduct their business on behalf of their employer. But we've seen incidents of motorbikes, public transport kicks into it. But from a grey fleet point of view, really the main element, the main mechanism is the privately owned car. And it's up to the employer what they want to do in terms of defining how people can get around. If they want to allow motorbikes or scooters or push bikes, well, the same things apply. The main asset that we see is the vehicle, without a doubt.
But Matt, who's at risk if an employee has too many demerit points and loses his license? Who's at risk in that stage?
John, that's a good question. The answer is potentially both parties, and it highlights the importance of policy and procedure. So the front line of defence for both parties, for the employer and the employee, is a well-written and comprehensive policy that relates to mobility. If the policy outlines provisions regarding driver licences and demerit points and areas of tolerance for the employer, and what happens if the employee incurs demerit points, and subsequently what happens if the employee goes over certain demerit point thresholds, and you can prove that the employee has read and understood and accepted that policy, and then there's a breach on the part of the employee, then the employee is at risk, because it's relatively easy to prove from an employer's point of view, hey, look, I put all of these things in place, I made it really clear what my expectations were around this. Here's evidence of the employee having read it, understood it and accepted it. And so therefore, if there's been an incident involving somebody with demerit points or driving unlicensed, it's relatively straightforward to push the conversation over to the employee. Because if the employer has spelt their requirements out through policy, the employee has an equal obligation under the Act to comply with them if they're found to be reasonable. And the demerit point thing is an interesting one, because the employee and the employer have to be able to prove that the employee can safely operate a piece of plant and equipment. Now, from a driving point of view, the easiest way to prove that out is if you've got a valid driver's license. That proves that, in no uncertain terms, that you're either lucky because you haven't been pinged, or that you are a good driver. You're endorsed to operate this piece of plant and machinery. But if you've lost your licence through demerit points, then you shouldn't be operating that piece of plant and equipment on behalf of your employer. So the policy is fundamental.
Okay, Matt, can you tell us a little bit about Plumfleet and what you do? You did speak about it slightly in the beginning, but can you tell us a little bit more detail around that?
Yeah, look, the genesis of our business really came about as a result of Kevin Rudd, believe it or not. All those years ago when Mr. Rudd, who was Prime Minister, decided that he might revoke salary packaging benefits, he created a lot of dialogue in the fleet industry about, well, if salary packaging and novated leasing dies from an employer's point of view, I'm not going to go back and buy a whole fleet of vehicles like I used to. I'm not going to go back to the traditional tool of trade. So I found that employers were talking about paying vehicle allowances to staff. And then that, I guess, kick-started this whole consideration of the grey fleet and what it meant and the obligations on the employer and the employee. From there, in conjunction with the co-founder of Plumfleet, Jeremy Snedden, he and I determined that there was a gap in the marketplace because no one really in Australia was acknowledging and tackling the issues associated with driver management and grey fleet. And so we started the business in 2014. We became Plumfleet late 2017. So we were reselling some software from the UK under a different name, but we determined that we really needed our own in-house software, our own capabilities, our own brand and our own equity, and we started Plumfleet, and we started to trade under Plumfleet in 2017. There are 4 pillars to our business. We provide driver and grey fleet management services, and I'll expand on that in a minute. We provide a system that assists with fleet management for smaller organisations. We have a pooled asset booking system, and we also have online driver training. And those 4 elements stitched together in a system that we call Plumtree.
So there's the grey fleet side of it, but there's the fleet management, the pool car management system, and also deep diving into those processes as far as the process documentation and doing audits and helping organisations do audits on their safety procedures.
Yeah, and to John's point earlier when we were talking about policy, the one of the things that we'll often do with an organisation is ask them to give us examples of their existing fleet policies and their driver management policies. We've developed a tool that allows us to check for key content in those policy documents that aligns to assessing grey fleet management risk and driver management risk. And what we often find is those policies and procedures are great from an entitlement point of view in spelling out who gets what vehicle or what happens when a fuel card gets lost or how often they replace tool or trade cars. But grey fleet is often missed in those policies altogether, and key components of driver management are missed altogether, whether that driver is using a tool or trade car or a grey fleet vehicle. And we'll often then work with organisations to enhance their policies from a grey fleet and a driver management point of view to ensure they're lining up with the risk that's presenting in their driver community. More often than not, they're covering a small section of their fleet, but they haven't considered who else may well be driving on their behalf and how to outline the roles and responsibilities of the drivers in that section of their fleet. So we do a lot of work around policy management and policy upgrades, Mark. And that often then leads to conversations about our system.
And how often should an organisation review these policies? Like given right now, we're in COVID, coming out of COVID with this new normal, would it be an expectation that every organisation should have a look at that policy right now and see whether it's up to date and to make sure that they protect their employees and also minimise the risk for the business?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd recommend in a normal market, in a normal operating environment, at a minimum, policies should be reviewed at least every 2 years. Doesn't mean you have to change them, but they should be reviewed. When there are significant market events, then all policies should be reviewed at that point. Now, be that a change in legislation, so for example, the introduction of corporate manslaughter in Victoria or the impact of COVID-19 across the board, policies should be reviewed. And you know, if you run a fleet of pool vehicles, for example, the obligation and the potential negative impact of COVID is massive on pool vehicle drivers. So how do you make sure that when the vehicle's being driven by John, for example, and John takes a pool vehicle out and he comes back in and Mark has the next booking, how do you make sure John has done the right thing in that vehicle in terms of hygiene so that when Mark gets in it, that he's not at risk of John having had COVID-19 or John being exposed to it? No different to a rental vehicle scenario or a taxi, but it's within the control of the employer because they're pooled vehicles. So what policies and procedures can an employer put in place to mitigate that risk?
So one example would be that every pool car needs to have disposable steering wheel covers or hand sanitizer in the vehicle,
in the car,
wipes, and every night someone would have to spray the interior of the car to sanitize it so that it's fresh for the next person. And there'd be some sort of sign-off process to say, confirm, sanitized on this date.
And for those listening to this who think that might be a stretch, we have clients that are doing that every single day at the moment. They have no choice to rely on pool vehicles to provide their services, and they are putting those procedures in place. We have a client that has a pool fleet whereby every second day the vehicles are taken out of the fleet and subjected to a deep clean every second day. Beyond the fact that every time they're used, there's protocols in place for hygiene because there's a risk. There's a very real risk to the health and safety of the employee.
Matt, are there any particular services and tools available to companies to minimise their risk in respect to the whole legal risk of the grey fleet? But are there any additional tools that grey fleets could use to support themselves?
We're not aware of anybody else in the market that provides a service like us. However, employers may have their own internal systems through human resources management or financial systems that will allow them to take some steps to mitigate their risk. But I'm not aware of a competitor that provides a product like ours, but often if we're dealing with a client and they discover that they have their own internal systems, they may well use those to protect themselves. the key thing is once you've got your policies up to date and in place, the question that we always ask our clients is, well, how do you enact these policies? So it's one thing to have a great policy document that says you're going to do all of these things, but if you don't put it into place, if you don't have a system to deliver it, then technically you're at greater risk. Because if you say you're going to do something and you don't do it in the context of workplace health and safety, as an employer, you're putting yourself at real risk of a breach. So how do you systematise, how do you bring to life the policy across all of those that it's designed to inform and protect? And sometimes internal systems will do that, and sometimes a system like our Plumtree system will do that for the employer. It depends how big the issue is, how broad it is, where their staff are, how regularly they're using their own vehicles, how regularly they're using any vehicle, to be honest, and what other risks the employer is looking to cover off.
And Matt, where do you see the future now with COVID, the future with grey fleets? Can you see the pendulum swinging back to more pool cars if we become risk averse, or is it the other way where there's going to be even more use of grey fleet vehicles?
I think it goes hand in glove with how far-reaching the impact of working from home will be for some organisations. Mark, you hit the nail on the head before. If we're working from home and we have a car in the car park that we can use to go and see a client or provide a service, it's highly likely we're going to use that car. We're not going to get in our own car, drive to a depot, pick up a pool car, and then take the pool car, provide our service and do the same in reverse. So I think if employers are more prone to let people work from home, the increase in use of privately owned vehicles for work purposes is a fait accompli. The grey fleet will grow, without a doubt. If we get back to actually we prefer to work in an office environment and we're not going to work from home anymore because it's too hard for the kids or whatever it might be, then it will balance out. But we have really seen a shift in the last 15 years in this country away from that traditional tool of trade vehicle. You know, here's your Corolla, here's your i30, here's your Commodore or Falcon in the old days, to here's an allowance, go and get what you want and then use that for work purposes. We're seeing that anyway. So I think it'll hasten change and speed up the use of grey fleet because I think it's inevitable people are going to work from home more as a result of COVID-19. Perhaps not as much as we're doing now, but certainly the trend has been set.
Matt, do you see any other gaps in traditional fleet management besides what you've mentioned today?
I think perhaps not a gap, but I think I don't know if enough organisations have really thought through the looming impact of EVs and what it means for fleets in Australia and how they have to educate their staff in pool scenarios. So I think a lot of Australian organisations, for a number of reasons, are not paying enough attention to EVs. It's a gap. And if you look at the bellwether markets like Europe and the UK and New Zealand, EVs are becoming more prevalent, and it's only a matter of time that they hit here. And they will have an impact on the structure of fleets, and they will have an impact on the way that organisations ask people to get about, in this time in the context of reducing CO2 and the associated costs. So once COVID moves on, and let's hope that's sooner rather than later, I really see in the next 3 to 4 years a continued focus on EVs and their role in traditional tool of trade fleets.
But with grey fleet, the take-up of EV would be slower because it's the individual's hard-earned money that is going to be paying for the higher capital cost to start with and wearing the depreciation and not get the credit for the carbon footprint other than the personal credit.
Yeah, unless there's a change in government policy there and incentives for the end user to move towards an EV in their grey fleet choice. I think that'll come, but I think that's a little way off yet in Australia. The reality is we've got bigger fish to fry here at the moment anyway. But look, and John, the other answer to your question is I think leasing and fleet management companies are great at doing what they do as core business, and that is buying, funding and disposing of traditional fleet vehicles and managing those vehicles. But that's a shrinking market and the margins in that are shrinking as well. So there's a much broader opportunity in the marketplace to target grey fleet drivers. And we're even seeing leasing and fleet management companies approaching us now to partner with us and white label our software to capitalise on that fact that there are other things that leasing and fleet management companies can be doing for their customers to help solve risks and issues. And I can tell you that we have partnered with Interleasing, and Interleasing will be bringing a white-labelled version of our Plumtree software to their customers. Hopefully within the next couple of weeks, we'll be launching that. So by that, Interleasing will be able to offer leasing and fleet management, but they'll now also be able to offer grey fleet management, driver management, pooled asset management, and driver e-learning to their customers. So just stitching up that whole solution for the customer and bridging that gap, because it's a delta. There's a delta there with the leasing companies. I have no doubt. They're good at what they do traditionally, but the need has grown to provide services across a much broader spectrum of drivers.
Yeah, Matt, thanks very much. I think we've covered some very good topics today and some interesting ones. I definitely have learned a huge amount because I didn't realise the risk in that for employer if they don't meet the right legislation requirements and that. So,
No, thank you, John.
Mark, do you want to do a summary?
Yes, the summary that I have put together from Matt, and thank you once again, Matt, for coming on the show today, because I think it is so relevant right now, and I share your view as far as where the future is for grey fleet. It's just going to get bigger, and especially when we look at the other information from Ben Sullivan on private ownership and how long those vehicles are owned for private individuals. And if organisations are wanting and enabling their employees to work from home, they're going to use their personal cars, as you've outlined.
Yeah.
And there is a preference to do that because there's a perceived saving in some ways. We're only going to pay for a car allowance for you. But what you've highlighted, and I'm keen to summarise, is that with traditional fleet, the retention periods are between 48 and 60 months. So realistically between 4 and 5 years.
Yeah.
And then the vehicles are turned over. So the triple bottom line of fit for purpose, safety, and the environment is managed and can be controlled by the employer.
Yeah.
But when you go to grey fleet, this is where control is lost by the employer. It financially sounds like a good idea, but there's actually a lot of exposure and risk for the employer when it comes to what vehicles their employees are using on behalf of them. And you highlight that it's actually driving a motor vehicle is one of the most dangerous things your employees can do. Apart from if you're in a mining company or you're on a multi-storey building site. But it's often taken for granted that driving a motor car on a public road is actually quite a dangerous exercise if they're doing it on behalf of you. And that duty of care and the chain of responsibility comes back to the organisation, and there are going to be some test cases that you flagged that will really bring this issue to the fore. So duty of care then rolls into what is your policy, and you need to review that policy document on what is that your motor vehicle policy for your employees and the vehicles that they use, not only just the vehicle, but their ability to drive, whether their licensing situation, whether they've lost their license, whether they're trained, whether they've got the appropriate eye care cover, all these elements about driving the car safely, you've got that process to cover that with and help employers with that policy document. And right now with COVID, it's the time to review it, because in good times you've outlined you should be doing it every 2 years. Right now is the time to do it. And you highlighted for pool cars, which I thought was fascinating. You've already got clients that are deep cleaning and sanitising their pool cars every day. So they're processing it, and there's logs, who's got what and where, and that needs to be in your policy document. So those elements are critical pieces in what is this grey fleet issue that's just getting bigger. Yeah. And it is going to be part of this new normal that we're living in. So for me, thank you. It's really a great subject.
If I can just close out on a comment for dealers, I guess, that I think grey fleet from a dealer's point of view should be seen as a great opportunity as well, because undoubtedly employers are going to start to enforce quicker turnarounds on new vehicle purchases for their staff if they're going to pay them allowances and let them use their own vehicle for work purposes. That then means employees potentially will have more cash in their pocket and will be directed to change over their vehicle more often. So if dealers are able to capitalise on that and build a program with their fleet customers for allowance drivers, not just novated, but allowance drivers, to capitalise and to incent the end user to come to their dealership to buy the new car for reasons X, Y and Z. I see there's a really good opportunity there for for dealers to drive sales as well. I'm not in the business of selling cars, but I do have an interest in that space, and I'd encourage dealers to look at that side of things, because staff are going to be required to change their vehicles more often. That means sales. How does the dealer capture those sales?
And Matt, for me, it gets back to this whole idea of safety for all of us on the roads. The newer cars are safer cars. So the younger the automotive fleet is on the road, when I talk about not just when it's at the car park, the younger the car park is, the safer it is for everybody.
100%.
So we actually want those older cars off the road, and for people to be using their newer motor vehicles that are better for the environment. They're safer for people to drive around in, and make it cost effective for everybody so they can maintain them properly, and we all have a very secure motoring future.
Correct.
Thanks very much, Matt. It was a really interesting discussion, and some great points came out of it.
Thanks for the opportunity, John and Mark. I appreciate it.
Well, hopefully you've enjoyed that episode as much as we've had in speaking with Matt. So, John, your thoughts?
Yeah, really excellent topic. I think it just amazes me how much risk there is, and if you're not aware of it, how you can be caught out or caught short. So I think it's something definitely companies need to look at and explore and see, and even get the services of someone like Matt in to address what their risks are. It's a very low profile thing that doesn't seem a big risk until the accident happens, or someone gets killed or injured, or a client gets killed or injured, that the seriousness of it comes out and what you can be held accountable to. Especially when you look at, you can be held, there's criminal charges brought against you, there's huge fines, there's a whole risk of things. So it's really important to look at. So a really good topic today, and I enjoyed listening to it.
Absolutely, I agree, John. Huge risk. So if you need any further information on this or any other topic that we've covered in the automotive series that we're putting together, or you need any other information on any other topics you'd like us to cover, please reach out to either John Sinclair or myself, Mark Pallavestra, on LinkedIn. Ensure you like us on YouTube, and tick the bell that you want to be notified for when the next topics get posted. They are weekly. And if you need any other information, or you want some consulting from either John or myself, please reach out to us on LinkedIn, because we'll be very happy to work with you on this or any other topic related to the auto industry. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this as much as we have enjoyed bringing it to you. Keep safe, and we'll speak to you in a week's time.